Good morning, everyone. We are Team ASA, and we would be presenting the Philippines and its economy over the years. So, Philippines is a Southeast Asian country which includes more than 7,600 islands. The capital is Manila, and the currency is Philippine pesos. The population is said to be more than 100 millions as of 2019, and it's a country with multi-ethical, multilingual, and multi-religions. The GDP per capita is said to be around 3,500 USD as of 2019, and the GDP growth was 6% annual change, with gross national income of around $1 trillion, with the GDP sector divided into agriculture, industries, and services. The inflation is at, as of 2021 is said to be of 4.5%.
Now, firstly, I will start by talking about the historical significance. So, since the end of the Second World War, the Philippine economy has had a mixed history of growth and development. Over the years, the Philippines has gone from being one of the richest countries in Asia to being one of the poorest. Growth immediately after the war was rapid for the Philippines, however, it gradually slowed over time. A severe recession in 1984 to 1985 saw the economy shrink by more than 10%. During his administration, President Ramos introduced a broad range of economic reforms and initiatives designed to spur business growth and foreign investment. Due to this, the Philippines saw a period of higher growth, but the Asian financial crisis triggered in 1997 slowed economic development in the Philippines once again. Next, I will be talking about Philippines during the American period. The occupational regime of the United States opened the Philippine economy to the world market. It chartered an economy of special relations and built the nature of Philippine civil service. With free trade, the US was able to enjoy cheap Philippine raw materials for its factories and a market for its processed exports. Even though the Americans had a positive presence at the provincial and local levels, the number of peasants grew and American investments caused enough harm to keep the Philippines a mere producer of raw materials and buyer of processed goods. The Filipino people also had become poor because the wealth of the land had been taken over by American big businesses in connivance with the local Filipino elite. Lastly, I will be talking about post independence of the Philippines from the US. In economic terms, we can say that the American colonial rule in the Philippines had promoted an intensely dependent export economy based on cash crop, agriculture, and extractive industries like mining. American capital had initially regarded the Philippines as merely a stepping stone to the fabled China market, and American trade with the Philippine Islands was initially inhibited by reciprocity treaties that preserved Spanish trade rights. When these rights had ended, US capital divided politically over the question of free trade. American manufacturers supported free trade, hoping to secure in the Philippines both inexpensive raw materials and markets for finished goods, whereas sugar and tobacco producers opposed free trade because they feared the Philippine competition. Lastly, the Payne-Aldrich Tariff of 1909 established free trade with the exception of rice and set yearly quota limits for Philippine exports to the United States.
Economy of the Philippines in the 1950s to 60s was that it was one of the top runners in the Asian region and was only behind Japan. The manufacturing NDP grew rapidly at 12% growth in the mid 1950s and an average of 7.7% growth in the GNP. But the import demands increased the export demands, and the foreign exchange was subject to corruption. And this led to a change in the policy. Philippines under Ferdinand Marcos. Ferdinand Marcos was elected as the new president in 1965 and was holding the position till 1986. But he imposed a dictatorship that allowed him to stay for more than 20 years. And under his rule, there was issuance of martial law, abolishment on the ban of three presidential elections, the bicameral to unicameral cabinet was changed. So his tenure was divided into two halves. First was from 1965 to 1980s, and then from 1980s to 1986. The first half led to the formation of a communist form of government and had some positive impacts on the nation. But then in the later 1980s, there was his economic policies was heavily criticized and later had to escape the country. Let's talk about the positive impacts that Marcos rule left on Philippines. The first is Green Revolution. Green Revolution led to an increase in the rice output that would help the poor people since a large income was spent on food, and the idea was to produce in a much more quantity so that the prices would go down. The poor farmers would share in the grains to rice producers. The new technology was labor intensive, and this would be a special advantage to small growers who have low labor costs. The third was landless agricultural workers would also benefit from this policy. Second up was export and agriculture forestry. First, in the year 1962 was a good one for Philippine export agriculture, but due to devaluation and deregulation of the foreign exchange, due to the corruption that happened, the effect started hampering. The products were of poor quality and were of poor value of money. And the Minister of Defense, uh, Juan Ponce and Raleigh, and his favor to his people led to a decline, and there was favoritism in which the cash was poor and it hampered the exports. Next up is borrowing money. The third strategy that Ferdinand Marcos followed was foreign borrowing, which was the key development in Philippines strategy during Marcos era. The primary rationale was borrowed money would speed up the growth of the Philippine economy and improving the well-being of the present and the future generation of Filipinos. So these were the three strategies that were followed in in Ferdinand Marcos' rule. But due to excessive borrowing of money, the Philippine economy became the slowest among the growing Asian regions. The main factor was that they thought that the success they would build on debt driven economy. From 1977 to 1982 itself, the total debt increases from 8.2 billion to 24.4 billion. And as a result, interest paying as a share of national income increased eightfold in the same period. The biggest reason was colony capitalism and favorism that happened. A lot of projects and work was given to people who were in good in the good books of the leader. Second up is a continuous increase in the GDP per capita is usually understood as an overall improvement in the economic welfare. But we saw a huge decrease from 1980 to 1986, and it was missing in Philippines. Philippines GDP per capita declined after 1982 and did not reach until 2003, and it took 21 years for the economy to grow from the setback. Next up is analyzing the countries that were in the Southeast Asia. They were growing at a very fast pace. South Korea, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, they were all growing. And by the time Philippines recovered, their neighbors had grown 2 to 4 times.
Moving into next slide, we're going to talk about the current situation of Philippines. According to a new report from the Asian Development Bank released on 2000 of 2021 in this year, April, shows that the new coronavirus downpinned the Philippines economic situation. The reasons are since the most of the economic activities had to be restricted, and the government had to use public spending on infrastructure and social assistance for COVID-19 vaccine process and for the other COVID related issues. The government's expansionary fiscal program and the monetary policy will be aimed to recover the economic damages done. For achieving that goal by growing for 4.5% GDP by 2021, the government is planning to strengthen the private sector by assisting labor programs and providing the initials for agriculture and tourism sector parties who got affected massively in this period. By continuing this above process and under controlling the COVID spread, the government is aiming for a growth by achieving 5.5% of GDP by 2022. And that's the end of our presentation. Thank you for listening.